All right, good afternoon, everyone. This table, this is like tall for me as well. and I'm pretty tall. All right, well, good afternoon, all. Good afternoon. We'll come together to respect everyone's time. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks all for being here on this late Thursday afternoon. I saw a bunch of people down in the lobby, but you chose to be here with us today. So I know, kudos to you all. So this is actually our second year presenting this topic, and it's something that we're all really excited about in terms of thinking about federal funding and how we got there, but more importantly, bringing so many of us in emergency medicine along the way, obviously preaching to the choir that our specialty is extremely important, and why not learn from us how hopefully we've been able to achieve some of our own successes. We've already eyeballed a couple experts in the room as well, and we'd love to hear your input as we go along too. But just to get us started, my name is Christine Garuya, now on faculty at Stanford, and we'll, come on in. Thanks. And we'll have a moment to introduce ourselves. These are our disclosures. And these are our learning objectives for the day, which are to really start with a 101, just understanding the process after you submit a grant to the NIH that hopefully demystifies it for you and doesn't make it seem as foreign, who to talk to along the way, and so on. We'll talk about effective communication strategies, because there are some tips and tricks in terms of communicating that may help the potential success of your current grant or even future grants. And then we'll consider some strategies that might, again, overall help with more favorable review. We'll start with intros, like I said, we'll conclude, and then we'll definitely have time for questions at the end, but we'd love if you have burning questions along the way, because we're a smaller group this time. It was standing room only last year. But if you have questions because we're a smaller group, please do raise your hand, and we'd love to hear from you as we go along. So, intros. As I mentioned, my name is Christine Garuya. I'm the Population and Global Health Research Director at Stanford. My current research is actually in global health. Good to see another global health friend at the front. And I mostly work on chronic non-communicable diseases. So that's just to say I've had to be a bit creative for some of you that might be thinking that in the room in terms of the way I think about my funding and my institutes and centers. So if that's you and you feel like you're in a very niche area, that has been my case as well, but you can do it too. My current funding spans across NIH, so I'm funded by what's called NIH LBI, the Heart, Lung, and, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, as well as NIDA, the National Institutes for the Drug Agency, and then also the Gates Foundation and the World Bank. So I've also been creative in thinking about how I fund outside of just NIH, but today we're talking mostly about federal funding. And that's it. I'm going to turn over to my friends over here.
Great, thanks, Christine. Nice to see everybody, and excited to learn from you all as well. My name is Peter Chai. I'm an emergency physician based at the Brigham. My lab does work mostly around applying technologies to understand changes in human health. And we do stuff from ingestible electronics to wearable sensors to population-based, wastewater-based assessments. And we like to link behavioral health interventions to the technologies. Let's see, my current funding is a mix, as I think you'll hear from most of the people on the panel. So a large portion of my portfolio is funded by NIDA, so National Institute of Drug Abuse, but I have funding from National Institute of Alcohol and NINR, which is the National Institute of Nursing Research as well. And also, we just got an ARPA-H grant, which has been really exciting. But I also have kind of other diverse sources of Gates Foundation funding as well, and industry funding as well. So that's me and Steph.
And Peter didn't tell you how his grant funded a farm, so when you talk to him after, ask him about the farm and the giraffe. So my name is Steph Carrera. I'm also an emergency physician, as my colleagues here, and I'm a medical toxicologist. And I'm at UMass in Worcester, Massachusetts. And my research program focuses largely on digital health for the substance use disorder space. So I design digital diagnostics and digital therapeutics to identify risk states in folks with SUD. So identify things like risk for overdose, risk for relapse, and potentially risk for development of opiate dependence, and then develop just-in-time interventions to hopefully prevent those risk states from coming to to fruition. So my funding is largely from NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse, as well as my colleagues. But I also have funding from NIBIB, which is the Institute for Bioimaging and Bioengineering, because of the technology aspect of my work. And I have recently finished a K-23. I have an R25 with Peter, where we have a program to mentor junior faculty in toxicology. So just a plug, if anyone's a toxicologist and wants to hear more about our program, we'll happy to talk to you later. And I also recently got an R01 from NIBIB. So that's mine. So now that you know a little bit about us, we want to hear about you guys. So we're not actually going to pick on anyone, but just by kind of show of hands, we just wanted to know how many of the people in the room have actually submitted a grant? Good. Okay, so most of you, but there's a few folks said. So for anyone who hasn't submitted a grant before, some of this might sound like alphabet soup, and sort of the terminology may feel a little foreign. But after you immerse yourself in the world a little bit, it's very, very manageable. It just takes some time. And then how many people have sat on a grant review panel before? Awesome. Okay, so a little bit less, maybe about a little under half of the room, which is fantastic. And then as we go through, we'd love to hear your experience too, right? If you guys have tips or tricks for the room, because obviously this all is just based on our experience, but there's a lot to be learned out there. Is there anyone from NIH, any program officers here? No? All right, so we can talk bad. No, I'm just kidding. We're not going to talk bad about them. They're fantastic. Yeah, it's a totally safe space, absolutely. So hopefully everyone will be able to gather a little bit from this. You know what we didn't talk about in our intros? We didn't talk about our peer review expertise. So we've all sat on NIH peer review panels. I started doing more peer review panels for SBIR grants or industry or commercialization grants, but more recently I've sat on panels for R01s and R25s and things like that, and I think Peter and Christine have as well.
Similar with Steph, I sit on a bunch of SBIR panels, R01, and then a few other random things.
And then the way it goes for NIH, for global health is with NIH, is there are a lot of requests for proposals. So I get invited ad hoc to different study review sections. And so it's been periodic over the past decade that I've sat on I think 4 now. Yep.
And as a spoiler alert, at the end, our call to action is going to be for you all to sign up, or at least consider signing up to be a reviewer, and we'll tell you how to do that. It's easy and it's incredibly beneficial. Okay, so I'm going to start off the talk with the very first part of the peer review process. So, and this is after you spent months and put your heart and soul into putting this crazy application, and it's 180 pages, and you're so proud of it, and you click submit, and then you think something magic is going to happen. And then you realize that for the next 18 months, nothing is going to happen. But there is a lot happening. So the first thing I would say, especially to folks who are a little bit newer at this, is just know that after you put all that hard work, the gratification is extremely delayed. It can be upwards of a year or 2 before you get funding, and it's oftentimes somewhere around I'd say 6 to 8 months before you actually, get a score or hear anything. So just know that that's built into the process, and if you expect it, it won't stop you from going on ERA comments and refreshing all the time, something's going to happen. But just know that that's built in there. So after you hit submit, your application is going to get reviewed for administrative things. Now, this isn't actually part of our slide deck, but this is one of the worst research experiences of my career, was getting an R01 rejected because a piece of administrative documentation was missing from the packet. And so take those things very seriously, work with your grants and make sure the pieces are in, and if you can ever submit your grant a couple days early, that it doesn't feel like an emergency department in medicine thing to do, right? We're all at the last minute, but know that can happen, and so do pay attention to those pieces. But after it passes the sort of administrative review, okay, all your pieces are in place, it's going to get assigned to a scientific review officer, or SRO, and it's going to get assigned to be reviewed at a study section. And so study section, you'll hear them, called, different things. But basically, it's going to be a panel of folks who's going to determine your fate or determine the fate of this grant. And one of the questions people ask is like, who are these magic people, right, that are on these panels? And the truth is, they're people like us and people like you. And so there are two main kind of study sections. Some are what they call standing study sections, which is people who are signed up for a several-year term. They meet 3 times a year, and it's the same group of people. Those study sections, their rosters are published online, so you can look at them when you sort of make requests about what study section your grant will go to. Take a look at it, right? Are there people on there with the right expertise? If it's a bunch of microbiologists, it's probably not the right person for the grants that are going to be submitted from this room, right? If there are emergency physicians on there, toxicologists and their global health folks on there, whatever is right for you, that's kind of an indication that you're in the right place. So this is what the rosters look like, and so they're the standing sections, and then they're also what they call ad hoc sections, which they, as Christy mentioned, they kind of put together for special announcements, or sometimes they'll add extra people onto standing sections. And those rosters you'll get those after with your summary statements. Every study section has a chair, and Peter has been the lucky or unlucky person. He can tell you which one it is, but the person who's been paying to be chair, it is an incredibly labor-intensive job, but he was the chair of a study section. And then it will list all the members. And there are emergency physicians on these, but there's not enough, which is, again, why I'm going to ask you guys all to consider being on them. I love when I look at the roster and see other emergency physicians. I kind of geek out about that, but we're certainly underrepresented, like in other areas of the review process. So I want you guys to really think about it. It helps us, it helps the specialty. And most importantly for you, it helps you, because I always tell people, if you want to write better manuscripts, become a peer reviewer to understand what they're looking for. And if you want to write better grants, become a grant reviewer. It really does pay dividends. And so most people think, I submit, some weird stuff happens, there's a black box, and then out come some summary statements that make me want to cry. But there really is a process behind this. And so when the SRO gets a roster or a group of applications that's going to go to the study section, they have to think about, how do I put together a panel of people that has all the complementary expertise? And so they're looking for people with the clinical expertise, the technical expertise, if they need it, right? Like, I often get a lot of engineers or computer scientists reading my grants because of the nature of what I do. There's going to be biostatisticians. There might be ethicists, depending on what they need. And they're going to assign your grant to between 3 and 5 experts that have complementary but very diverse expertise, okay? Those people, the studies, the SROs generally find them by emailing people and asking or begging them to serve. And we're all like, oh, good, another one. But once they agree, they get on there. When I agree to do a study section, I typically think of it as at least a 30 to 40 hour commitment before the meeting. So that's the average amount of work I put into doing my reviews. And then the meeting is going to be 8 hours, either 1 or 2 days of 8-hour sessions, so it could be up to 16 hours. Sometimes you travel for it, sometimes, and more recently they've been hybrid or a lot of virtual, but it's an incredible commitment on the part of the reviewers, and it's essentially uncompensated. They pay you like a very small honorary, like $200 or something. So it's essentially uncompensated volunteer work. But once you're on the panel, they assign each reviewer somewhere between usually 6 to 10 applications. Remember, those applications are 160, 180 pages to kind of fish through, so it's a lot of work. And your particular application will usually get between 3 and 5 reviewers. And about 4 to 6 weeks before, the reviewers will get their pile, and then they start to go through them. And for every application, they're asked to read it thoroughly and write a critique. And those are the review criteria that you already know that are going to be changing next year, right? But things like significance, innovation, investigators' approach, and environment. They're asked to score each category on a scale of 1 to 9, with 1 being the absolute best and 9 being the worst. And then they're asked to give an overall impact score. And so that's kind of the core part of those summary statements you get at the end, or those reviewer critiques, right? And then they submit them. The SRO takes, kind of tallies all the grants in the pile, and then ranks them based on the average overall impact score. And then they draw a line right about the 50th percentile, right in the middle. Okay, anything that is in the lower half of the pile is not discussed. So if you ever get a grant and they say not discussed, it happens to all of us. It's definitely happened to me. It's a thing. That's your grant is sort of dead in the water there. It doesn't mean you can't. You can still resubmit. You still get good feedback, but it just doesn't move on to the point where it actually gets discussed at that meeting. If you're in the top half, which will happen to you all as well, then you're moving on to round 2, right? Think of it like a game show. You're moving on to round 2. that right before the meeting, all the reviewers actually, once they submit, have the chance to look at the other reviewers' critiques and then decide, oh, did I miss something important? Or did I find strengths that they didn't, or did they find weaknesses that I missed, et cetera? And they can actually change their score and recalibrate. So if you ever see a summary statement that has scores and descriptions that don't seem to match, it's usually because someone changed their scores and didn't change their comments, or vice versa, based on discussion or reading other reviews. So sometimes that does happen. But then you get to the meeting day. So this is the big day of the meeting, right? And again, they're sitting around. So if you're lucky, you get discussed early in the morning when everyone's fresh and had some coffee and feels good. If you're unlucky, you may be discussed at hour 16 on day 2. It's just the luck of the draw. They used to discuss them in order from the highest scoring to lowest scoring, and then they've started done away with that because people get real crispy at the end. And so now they basically, it's sort of a random order. And what happens at that table, or that sort of Zoom meeting, is that the 3 people who reviewed your grant are going to be the only people in the room who have actually really looked at it. Some people might have kind of looked at it, but really those are the people. And what you want is you want them to be your advocate. So you want to have written a grant that they loved reading so much that no matter if they're a biostatistician, a computer scientist, a clinician, an emergency physician, an internist, that they feel strongly about it and they want to convince that entire room to feel good about it too. What you don't want is for them to be annoyed that they read it. I didn't understand, or had to go through it too many times and be your anti-advocate. I don't know what the word is for anti, but you don't want them to be advocating against your grant. But it happens, and each one of them is given somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes to talk about your grant, and then the entire room starts discussing it, asking them questions, and then they all give you an overall impact score between 1 and 9. And then that gets tallied up in some weirdo formula that's not exactly a mean, but that's how you get your impact score. So you get that impact score of 22 or 59 or whatever. It comes from that entire room score. While this is happening, the chairperson is frantically trying to write down everything everyone is saying, right? If a reviewer 1 says, I didn't like this, and a reviewer 2 says, I really love that, and the room is kind of bursting in discussion, the chair is trying to capture all that on paper, and the paragraph that they write about that discussion is called the summary of discussion. So when you get the summary statements back, that first paragraph, that's the summary of discussion, that's the chair trying to tell you what the vibe in that room was like. And you'll hear some key words like, enthusiasm is the one we like to use when we like things, and dampened enthusiasm is what they like to say when they didn't like things. And they'll talk about these are the phrases, and then you feel really special when you get to write reviews and write things like that. But what they'll also talk about is that there was they couldn't come to consensus on XYZ point, or and you can kind of get a sense for what things were maybe a little controversial and people couldn't agree on. And then those summary statements are put together. So a couple of days after the review, usually within 48 to 72 hours, you're going to see a score. Your impact score will pop up. And then somewhere between a couple weeks, and I think they have up to 30 days to post the summary statements, I believe, the actual summary statements will post. What you will do is you'll know the date that your grant is going to study section, and if you are a normal investigator, you will start logging in the day before and hitting refresh over and over and over, like nothing's going to happen, and then eventually it will pop up, usually on a Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock. And so that's sort of the process, and then you're going to get those summary statements. I'm going to hand it over to Peter, and he's going to talk about what happens next after that process. You have your summary statements, but something else is happening in the background too. Yeah.
So just 2 things to add to that. One, landing how to look at your SRG or use it. So either sort of intra, like right after you hit submit, you're able to go and look at who's on the SRG for sure, and some period before that. And I go so far as, because I work in global health, or maybe you work in underserved communities or whatever, to look at those people's PubMeds to see if they've ever published anything in a developing setting, or if you're working in a really underserved population, if they've ever worked with an underserved population, because there's so many limitations, as we all know, if you work in those areas, to being able to do certain levels of rigor of a study or missing data or whatever else. So I go that far as to do that. And then the second piece, just to amplify, which we'll talk about later, stepping up to be on the study section, is you may go on and look and find that one of your best buds is on your study section, but your best bud also often has to recuse themselves from reviewing your grant, because of course there are conflicts of interest that we have to state before we review. You know that if you've reviewed. So it's important to have a slew of EM people that are not all your best buds who are available on the study section. So just be aware as as you look at that, if you see your best bud, it may or may not, work out well for you. So.
And if your best friend is on study section, please do not contact them about it, because that opens up a huge issue of federal regulations. But I will also emphasize what Steph said. These reviewers who are reading your application are probably doing them in the middle of other things, and that's just the most important part about being concise and clear. And so, I'm submitting things for an R01 study section in 2 weeks, and I read them on a plane here. So you want to think about your reviewer and what they're doing with their daily life. And people may read 1 or 2 sentences or a paragraph here and there, and so it's just really important to be as clear as possible, and signing up for study section is a great way to find out how to do that. All right, so you get your score, or you get a not discussed, which happens to me all the time, and then you're like, okay, what's next? Because then you're sitting around and waiting, you're like, okay, what's next? What's the score, right? Because we're emergency physicians, and we're really bad at waiting, right? We want the result now. But this is not like a stat lab. This is like a lab that gets sent out that comes back like 6 weeks later. So what will happen is your score will go to council. And what council is essentially the opportunity for all of the program officers to come together and discuss their whole slew of grants for that cycle. And Christine will talk a little bit about this, but this is why it's really important to get to know the PO or the program officer that is assigned to your grant, because similar to the reviewers who read your grant and will advocate for you in study section, now once you get a score, your program officer is going to go to your institute and talk to the institute chair and say, I really like this grant, and this is why we should fund it. So even if you get a really good score, it does not guarantee that you're going to get funded. It's really kind of a mix of different things, budget issues, and also advocacy from your program officer that will help you make it through council. Who is on council? There's always a chair of the council who is the institute director. And so this is an example of Nora Vokow is the director of NIDA, and so she's the chair of the NIDA council. But you can see that there's a lot of kind of varied expertise in council. So it's not just the POs, and it's not just researchers, but there'll be community members and people in advocacy organizations who will listen and hear about these grants that are being presented. And this, once again, kind of harps back on this idea of making sure you write to your audience and making sure things are clear. Because you'll have content experts who read this, but they may not be right in the weeds of everything that you do. Cool. So the council will meet, and basically they will recommend. Typically, if you get a better score, you're probably going to get funded, but it's still kind of a mix of, they will recommend these for funding, and then the institute chair will essentially sign off, and then a few weeks after council, you will get, hopefully, a notice of award. I'll say that in the past few years, things have been pretty difficult at council because of our government lacking a budget. And so you'll see that things will get scored. What has happened recently is things will get scored, and then they'll sit in council. They'll go to council, and they'll sit for several weeks. And part of that, if you follow the news, is waiting for these renewals of budgets for NIH. And so there's always delays associated with whether or not they're going to have the budget to fund these in the next fiscal year. And if anyone's submitting in the next few cycles, we are in an election year, which makes things even more difficult and delayed because no one is sure what's going to happen in an election year. But many different directors of different institutes, and really, when you think about it, these directors are the people that are actually going to fund your grant. So you need a decent score, and you need advocates for you in review and study section. But then you also need your PO who can advocate for you as well. So I think. Cool. So we're going to move on to the next section with Christine.
All right, thank you so much. So let's just pause for a moment and see if there are any questions. Again, I'm going to pull up the last slide, just to kind of walk you through, hopefully, demystifying some of the murkiness about who's looking at your grants and the phases it's going through, and any three of us can answer. So I saw your hand first, Manish, at the back. Yeah?
Manish on Stanford. I had questions about what happens at council and what happens at the Institute Center Director level. So at council, they give a recommendation. Is there any room for negotiation? Because, and I'm speaking from experience when I submitted my U01, they asked me to do something, and I felt compelled to comply. But I felt like if I didn't, I wasn't a situation where it's made it to that step, but then it doesn't get funded? Those kinds of
I can add something after, but go ahead.
So, to the first point about them requesting things, I can't say every one of the grants I've had funded, but at least 3 of them I can think of off the bat. There's been a request, and I've always complied because you're just gonna. I've never tried not to. They're usually a reasonable request. My K-23, they cut a year off. They're like, can you do the same work in 1 year less? And I was like, no, yes, because of some rules around Ks, because I was on an institutional K before. One of them, they asked me to add some outcomes, change my milestones, whatever. So unless you guys have other recommendations, my recommendation is usually to comply, because it's usually like some bugaboo that somebody got hung up on in the room, and that's how they make everyone happy, is my sort of sense of it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I will say that the one thing we didn't really talk about is, like all federal institutions, once you get these grants, there is a scientific review, but we have to remember there's also a political review. And part of that was, depending on which party is in power, there are specific things that they want to see in specific language. And so some of that is kind of these recommendations are not truly recommendations. I just had a grant that hopefully, knock on wood, is on the verge of being funded. But we had very specific requests to change some of the language and kind of how to phrase the outcomes. The science is the same, but I think the implication is that I would definitely do that. And then for your question before I pass it on to Christine, at the third level from the institute, is there any room for negotiation or movement? I think there is. So while this process is relatively rigorous, I think there's a lot of what my PO calls elasticity at NIH. And so it's really about, who you know and how you kind of talk to these people. And I feel like half of this game is very kind of getting these personal relationships. And that's why we should all serve as reviewers, because once you become a reviewer, you get to know the SROs, you get to know what they kind of are looking for, the styles that they want people to write in, and I think it helps. And you've had experience.
Yeah, so I got invited to NIDA to give a talk after I was at an addiction conference, and one of the POs was there, and he's like, "Can you come give a talk on that at NIDA?" And I was like, "Sure, why not?" And the awesome thing is, I was just too naive to know how scared I should be or how intimidated I should have been, because I gave the talk to Nora Volkow, and then. Within 2 months, 2 of my grants who had been sitting in, that post-council review got funded, a K-23 and R-44. So those relationships really matter. And then the other thing that Peter's PO always says is, like, no matter what you think, you can buy the champagne, but don't pop the bottle until you have the notice of award in hand, because anything can happen. And every grant I have had where they're like, this is going to get funded, they're like, probably, like, they won't commit to anything. So until you have that notice of award in hand, at any point, it kind of stinks, but at any point they really can change their mind, priorities change, politics change.
Correct. I don't have anything different to add except same. My second R21 was funded after a PO sent me this murky email saying, let me check on this one other thing, and then suddenly, a couple days later, it was funded. So I agree that there's a very human aspect to it, and if there's a request, I would generally say, unless it's something that you want to change, like a major aim, or you just don't have the capacity to, and then just submit for the next deadline if it's available, or a different mechanism if that deadline is not. So yes, I think the overall answer is yes, and there's a very human aspect to your POs, which we'll talk about next. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Oni from MGH. My question is about the scores. So you said the lower the score, the better. Are there times where your score has been low and it wasn't funded? And can you always give a reason for that? No.
So the answer is yes and no. So I've had the exact same score for the grant I was just talking about that did get funded, and I've had another grant recently that actually had a lower, i.e. better score, where the PO frankly just told me they're not getting the global health piece. In the room, the reviewers are not getting it, and it was not funded. And it still lives in council reviewed world, it could get picked up or magically funded after going to give a talk at NIH or something. But so yes, so the answer is yes, it can. It can be lower, but if they don't get it, or the PO doesn't, or it's not an institution priority, or the director feels it's not their priority, or there's a political agenda going on, or funding is being cut, so your institute doesn't have as much money. For all those reasons, there are reasons it could still not be funded. But I would say it's not as bingo-ish or unpredictable as you would think. It'll be mostly clear probably why that's happening. So.
The one thing I would add, Christine, before you move on, is that some institutes publish pay lines. And again, I don't think they're 100% rigid, but they're much more consistent than others. So for example, NIDA, which we're all funded through, does not publish pay lines. So they will never say a score above or below X percentile will get funded. NIBIB does. And that was actually really cool. When I was like, wait a minute, look on the table. I'm a numbers person. I like to know where there are thresholds, right? Like is the troponin abnormal or is it not, right? Whatever. So with my R1, NIBIB's pay lines, I think it was the 19th percentile for everyone, for all comers, and then the 24th percentile for ESIs, people with early stage investigator status, which we'll talk about. And mine was like the 22nd, and I was like, oh my God, it's going to happen. So it's much more concrete. It's still not 100%, but you can pretty much, it's much more reliable than NIDA, which is we fund the things that we like that are scored low. So depending on the institute that you guys aim for, there may be a little bit more or less guidance there.
Cool. We're skipping ahead a little bit. Was there, maybe just go for you and then we'll keep moving just in the interest of time. Go ahead.
Brittany Petras from OSU. You had mentioned looking to see who was on the study section. With special emphasis panels, are there any?
Yeah. So same. So those are usually what I'm on, special emphasis panels. And so you can see who's going to be on them. Usually at least, because they're contacting us not that long ahead, but far ahead, but 6 weeks in advance. So you're able to also go look those up. And sometimes they're recurring, so you can actually, if you know the code, you can actually look for them on NIH. It's Googleable. If that's not available, you should be able to ask your SRO as well. There may be somebody who's in your field that you, don't get along with, and you really don't want to review your grant, and that's okay too. So yes, you can also ask for those. Yeah, great question. Okay, so we're getting to, I think, some questions about our tips for the road, anecdotal type of things, which are later on in our section, but I think this is fine. So hopefully now you have some sense of the continuum of events, and we're going to move on to effective communication strategies that we've talked about a little bit. Sorry, our clicker is not working, which is why we're standing at the table here. So this is just a loop to kind of show you where you might find yourself at any point in the continuum of submitting your grant, which is generally not exactly cyclical. You may be bouncing around to a few different areas. Of course, you're coming up with your idea, ideally with a mentor, maybe your research team. You're determining the correct NIH mechanism or program. What kind of award should I be applying to? Should I be going up for a K? Should I be applying for an R21? Should I be applying for an R01, which is what my former mentor at Yale, Gail D'Onofrio, says is why are you applying for an R21? Apply for an R01, right? And you'll hear that from some mentors. If some of that language is a little unfamiliar to you, we do have a more basic talk with some other awesome research committee members tomorrow at 10 a.m. It's not just a plug, but it's something that is a bit more fundamental or foundational if you're interested in going to that. But figuring out which award mechanism or program to apply to, and you're waiting for your response, and of course submitting somewhere along the way, maybe resubmitting, as we've all done. But the beauty of this all, at the center, as we started to talk about, is engaging your PO. And they will pitch in, chime in as well on their stories, but I will tell you a very personal experience, especially because we don't have any POs here today, that I had the chance to participate in a program at NIH called the TIDER program. It's unfortunately since retired, but there's a similar implementation science training program called TIDERC. So it's essentially, it's called the Training Institute for Dissemination and Implementation Research in Health, which just means it was an implementation science training program. And it was a very intimate program. You had to apply for nationally, get selected. I think there were maybe less than 50 of us, and each of us had two POs per table you had a chance to very closely develop a relationship with. And let me tell you guys about the level of schmoozing I saw in that room. It was like residency fair all over again, but worse. And I was like, these adults are literally kissing you-know-whats to know. And so I always say this just to say, other people are doing it, so do not be afraid to be, hopefully not quite that bad, but to form relationships and close relationships with them because other people are doing it. And so this comes at really every phase of this cycle. You may be at idea generation, and in this stage, you might want to have even a very basic specific aims page, which hopefully is not an unfamiliar term. That's your one pager with your 3 objectives that you're hoping to accomplish, and you're going to submit it to your PO at that point and say, hey, I'd love to have a 30-minute call with with you about this idea, and that conversation is going to go something like mission and priority alignment to your institute, what kind of mechanism or program might I want to be looking at, and what kind of level do you think I should be going for R21, R01, and so on. You might be at the stage of picking, like I said, the program or the type of mechanism, kind of similar conversations, or you might be either at the submission or waiting for a response process, and trying to figure out whether you're at the right SRG, scientific review group, or not. And that may also come into talking with your SRO versus your PO, but either way, you can talk to them if you feel like your SRG, after you've hit submit, is not quite the right fit for you. One anecdotal story as well that I had most recently, I actually had them distinctly switch my scientific review group after I'd already hit submit, because it went to a much more basic science type of group, kind of like what Steph was alluding to, and I was like, these people are not going to get my grant. And they actually did switch it, and we had a little bit of a back and forth, and the initial chair of the SRG was like a little bit in disagreement, but the SRO was like, yeah, I totally agree with you, we'll just switch it, and they did. So you are empowered to be able to switch it if you feel, and it's to be expected. I'll speak just briefly about after the submission, which I think is very, very key. A lot of people don't get mentored on this, and then I'll have my colleagues chime in, which is after you hear back to that looming, re-click, refresh, episode, and you get back your summary statement. You're going to go ahead and you're going to email your PO the next day or two within the next week to have a discussion. Hey, has anyone heard of that before? Like right after you get your summary statement, anyone talk to their PO? Like right after, I see a head nod and head nod. Okay, so the reason you want to hear that is because these people they're the one person you're going to talk to that's actually been in the room at the meeting. And they can give you that, as we say in EM, like that gestalt of what was happening in the room, which is extremely invaluable. Of course, they're bound to certain regulations. They're not going to mention names. They may not be able to give you specifics, but they can certainly tell you things like, unable to generate consensus, what does this diminished excitement or enthusiasm actually mean, and actually tell you where people were getting stuck. And oftentimes, because they're PhDs themselves, by the way, they're scientists, right? They kind of know what's going on with your methods and this kind of thing. Sometimes we'll even give you like quite specific suggestions, and I would say on average, 90% of them are actually very helpful. I've had like 10%, maybe one or two that were not helpful or even like rude. So those are some of the ways you might want to engage or have encounters with them. Do you guys want to add anything?
I would agree. I think engaging with the POs, even if the score is poor or if you're not discussed, is important, just to think about next steps, because you never know what the priorities of that institute are. And so, I had a SBIR grant, a business grant that was reviewed several years ago that got a really bad score, but it turns out it aligned perfectly with a need from NIDA, and no one else was doing it, so we got funded. And that was all a conversation with the PO around can you change a few things and make it work? So these kind of relationships are important. I think it's more than just a grant. Like I've had one PO from IK, and I have an Avenir Award with the same PO, and I've now gotten several kind of referrals from other researchers through my PO. So they'll say like, oh, I know this person does this type of kind of digital health research, and I found another person who just emailed me about a grant, maybe you should be collaborating. And so they'll introduce you to other opportunities as well.
I love that. So great. Yeah, can you ask me?
So I guess I would just speak to the variety of sort of personality types and responsiveness of POs. So I've had a couple, and I would not say this to deter anyone from reaching out, but what I would say is if you reach out and you have an interaction that's not favorable, just know that that's less common, and that you should still try. So the program officer on my SBIRs, who's actually Peter's program officer too, is fantastic. He has been an aggressive advocate for us. He really helped us figure out how do we frame our sort of work in the right way to get the grant. And then he actually told us about another opportunity. He's like, you should submit for this next SBIR, and here's how it should be different from the first one, and really helped us get our second one. We've given talks together at conferences. He reaches out to me to co-submit symposia and things like that. So it's wonderful. I have the I won't say which grant's on because that would give things away, but one of my program officers has never spoken to me or like has never returned any of my emails. So I emailed her, and actually before the grant got funded, I got a response from the person that the institute hired to check her email because she's too busy, and they said you can talk to me through her. I almost felt like it was like one attending on another service that won't speak to you. You have to talk to their resident first. I'm like, am I presenting to you? And then they relayed my messages, but I have never had a conversation with her. And okay, I guess it's okay. Like the grant's funded and we're moving forward, but there's just different personality types and different sort of priorities. The other thing is that I think sometimes people get assigned primary portfolios of grants as POs, but they also have higher level administrative responsibilities in the institute, and they're going to be less responsive than people who don't have other stuff. So just keep that in mind. But always reach out, and if you're not getting the answers that you want, reach out to a different program officer. Yeah, you can find other people that will be absolutely helpful.
Completely agree, and then would love to hear some feedback if anyone else wants to add or any questions on this phase, but similar to your last point, Steph, is that I've had a PO who was formerly NHLBI, formerly NIDA, formerly NIMH, and now is elsewhere, who's sort of been my consistent PO that I go back to that is extremely friendly, happened to have lived in Nairobi, Kenya for Global Health People. I've actually invited her to give a talk, like to different audiences, and she's sort of my PO I go back to. So you may not have to go with a PO that's on the FOA or whatever to be your main point person, although you may have to try and interact with them, but you can try other POs to guide you to the right place, the nature of your grant, and so on and so forth. Go ahead.
It's not a question, but some like a PO experience, I would say. I think it's also really great to build a relationship. Like in my case, I've had multiple supplements while on my K, and these supplements that get funded once you have a funded grant, you're often eligible for additional admin supplements, and some of them can be quite large, like 100K, 240K, and the PO will work with you. Like I said, there's a huge additional administrative burden we weren't anticipating because NIH changed its rules for reporting of clinical trials. Like, I need more money for a data manager, and she's like, well, how much do you think you need? I'm like, about 20 grand, and she's like, submit a supplement, it got funded. I'm also probably going to get a sixth year of my K award funded because they halted my clinical trial during COVID. So I think if you have that good communication, they can really function as your advocates, and getting supplements is way easier than getting a first grant.
Does everybody understand a supplement? Yeah, so you can get extra money for your grant, either to hire somebody to add a sub-aid and so on to your grant if you're successful at getting funded in the first place. Thank you for adding that and getting your case and so on with a good relationship. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask about, like, talking to the program officer before you submit, and you don't know who is officially assigned, because, like, I'll be applying to NHLBI, and there's so many, and so I've met with one who was the program officer for a similar grant, but, like, what if you're talking to someone and then, like, that is not the assigned program officer for your grant? Because I've understood from my mentors, like, greasing the wheels is helpful, and, like, sending your spec aims and stuff. Yeah. Like, what if it ends up being the wrong person? Right. So,
I was actually going to say where to find the person. So on this long sheet that hopefully you've all seen called your funding opportunity announcement or RFA or RFP, at the very bottom or sometimes on the main institute/center website should be the name of a PO or a number of POs. But technically their job is to be able to route you to the right person. So it's okay, except that it might waste some of your time if they're not really reaching back out to you if you find the wrong person. But I would say it's their job to be able to tell you these are our mission priorities. These are the current mechanisms or programs we have. This is what's coming in case it's not applicable to what you have right now, and this is who else you should talk to, or what other institute you should talk to for co-funding or primary funding. So I'm sorry that was a bad experience, but also if you need help, I think any three of us are definitely willing to help and/or talking with your mentor to help find the right PO. So you want to answer?
Yeah, I would say I do that all the time. I just talk to POs. With specific aims when I want to apply for a grant. But I mean, I have this grant, this R01 that's going in July, and it's gone through like 3 different PO. I've talked to 3 different people about it already. And at this point I've figured out that you can be kind of direct with them because these POs are paid for by our tax dollars, so they're required to like answer and help you. And so you kind of want to take advantage of it. And so, I've asked them, the reason I've gone through 3 of them is, I was like, are you going to be the PO if this gets funded? And the first person was like, no, that's a good question. No one's ever asked me that, but maybe I should tell you the person that likely would be it. And I asked that person, and I met with them, and then they said, I'm not, but I know who it's going to be. And so now I finally have a person at NCCIH who potentially, maybe 90%, would be my PO, and then they can give you technical feedback because they're content experts. They go to that study section. They know the vibe and how that study section functions. And I got a lot of really good advice from them. So I think it's totally worth it. And even if they're not going to be your PO on that grant, they might be one for the next one. And they, as long as you got a good relationship with them, they may come to you and send you things and all that. So totally worth it.
Yeah, the one piece I would add to that is that just like if you ask 3 people to review a manuscript or a grant, you get 3 slightly different answers. POs are human too. So I've had that situation where I had to speak to a PO, and then a grant goes to the next step, and it goes to a different PO, and then their feedback is different. So just anticipate that human component of it. It definitely makes you want to pull your hair out a little bit. 'Cause you're like, someone else told me to do something different. But other than that, there really is no downside, and it just builds your network within the institute, and usually they will be good about sort of understanding their colleagues. And so this one grant that I have that's in the review process is just went to council. I have 3 POs on this email chain, and I include them all on every one of them. And they have, I actually want them to hear each other's different feedback, so maybe they can sort of arbitrate a little bit. But they've all been really helpful and give me a different perspective on it.
Thank you both. These are all great questions. Thank you. So I think we're kind of getting to answering some of the questions we were going to get to, which was some of the on the ground actual experience behind this process. And now we're switching a little bit. I'm going to ask again each of them to pitch in or chime in with their behind the curtain of the actual review, having been on the review trail as well. And so some of the questions you've already asked, but just speaking to some of what your experience has been with doing a review, what maybe has been your biggest surprise, and then your biggest piece of advice for those submitting. And we can all just kind of go around, and then we'll probably wrap up, getting at time.
Yeah, so I think what really surprised me is how much the 3 reviewers that are assigned to your grant and their understanding of your grant influences the tone of the discussion. And you have to remember that the loudest person is usually the person who's heard, right? So if the loudest person on your panel happens to be your advocate, that's great. And if they're not, it's not. It really sets a tone. And so for me as a reviewer, I take it as my responsibility to be an advocate. And so when I review grants, I start off wanting to love them, and sometimes I don't, and that's okay. But I start off assuming it's going to be amazing. But your challenge as a grant writer is to write a grant that, again, a clinician, a bioengineer, biostatistician, engineer, computer scientist, ethicist, all those people can read it, easily understand it, but also appreciate the sort of complexity and the rigor, and can be able to defend it. And if you write it in a way that is sort of enjoyable and easy, but also gives them all the pieces, all the ammo they need to defend you. So when I'm writing a review and I'm like, what's the innovation, right? And I have to write something. If someone has an awesome section on innovation, they've written my review for me, it's lovely. If someone's innovation section says, my grant is innovative because I'm cool and because this is the best thing ever, that doesn't help me, right? That doesn't help me advocate for them. And the same thing with the other sections. If I have to hunt for things and it's hard for me to piece things together, what they're trying to do, I start to get worried as a reviewer that this is kind of smoke and mirrors, and that the actual execution of the grant will be subpar. And so really you have a tough job, but as you write, think about who you're writing to, as opposed to writing this like a manuscript or something else. I think that's really what I've learned the most from this process.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as a reviewer, I've got 2 little kids, and so I'm like reading things while they're taking a bath and stuff. And so you want to think about that, because that's what a lot of people, or like a lot of reviewers are like us, we're clinicians. And so you're reading them after a busy shift or something, and you don't want to try to look up what this weird acronym is, or, read a page that is all text. It just makes people angry, and you don't want them to get angry because they're really going to bat for you. And all it takes in study section is for some random person to be like, oh, I just skimmed this thing that, you spent, months writing, but I skimmed this and I don't understand what this thing is. And then suddenly everyone in the room's like, oh yeah, you're right, I don't get that either. And then that just snowballs on itself, and then the score gets worse and worse and worse. So you just want to make it super clear. Like that, I think that's the biggest thing. The only thing I'll add is, so I've been chair of study section previously, and I think the really interesting thing is, so when you become a chair, you actually go through with the SRO like a week before, and you triage the grants, so you get to see what is, going to be discussed and what is not. And you actually have a lot of power there, because the not discussed ones you can flip to discussed before this all happens. So you can kind of adjust that line based on the grants. And the way that SROs do that, which I learned, is by reading the abstract. So I know a lot of people have taught like the abstract's the last thing you write because no one really reads it. I think no one really reads it except for the SRO. So I've learned that, I think the two biggest important pieces in these grants are the abstract, because that someone might look at that and try to flip you into being discussed, or a PO will take that. That's what the institute directors are reading. And then the specific games page, which is what everyone on study section is going to read at. So like when we go through study section, if you haven't looked at the grant, you'll pull it up if you think it's interesting or you have content expertise, and you just read the specific games page. So those are, I think, the two really important pieces that I learned.
Agreed. Essentially, I will say the takeaway is assume they're reading it, as they say, on the train down to DC. They're reading it on the train down to DC. My first time, I remember I contacted my mentors, and I was like spending all these hours reading and reviewing, and I wanted a framework from one of my mentors and how they did a review. Most people are not doing that. Okay, they're reading on the train down. So make it easy. This comes to action points of appropriate bolding or appropriate italicizing, having other people who are not in our specialty read your grant, having other people and not in our specialty read your grant, have other people not in our specialty read your grant. Those are my two big points. Just in the interest of time, I think we are off to you.
Okay, so I promised you that this was coming because we want you guys to get this experience so that you can write better grants, but also because we need representation in our specialty. We want you guys to consider being a peer reviewer. So who are the peer reviewers and how do they get there? Well, peer reviewers sort of essentially come in a couple different flavors. Largely, they're PIs that have received an NIH grant. So I went through a different pathway, which I'll talk about in a second, but I think once you actually get funded, you get kind of lumped into the lister of your expertise as listed in there, and they consider you as someone who they may reach out to. But there's also some people who aren't necessarily PIs, depending on the study section. And those are people, for example, in the SBIR, the Small Business Innovation Research Grants, they'll have people with industry expertise, so company CEOs will be there. They may not be funded, but they're there to judge the commercialization potential of a particular technology or the business plan and things like that. And again, you have to have something specific to bring to the table that's going to enhance the review of a particular grant or enhance the discussion of the study section. But if you're not funded yet in your early career, you can actually sign up for this program called the Early Career Reviewer. So pretty much everyone would qualify this by the time you're junior faculty. And this is a program where you basically reach out. The requirements for application are, I think you attach your CV and you need your ERA Commons username and a brief blurb about your expertise. And you can sign up. And if you're selected, which they do select a lot of people, you basically, you don't have to be funded, but you have to have some track record of publications and some research experience, again, at the very entry level. If they select you, you'll get assigned to a study section. Eventually, you'll get invited. They'll typically give you like 2 or 3 grants to review, and they'll make you a reviewer 3. So it's really easy. You can just be the last person that goes, yeah, like what they said, right? You can just nod along if you want to. But it's lovely because you get that experience without the huge commitment of having 10 applications and being reviewer 1 and having all the pressure on you, and you learn, you network with people there, especially if you get to go in person. It's really cool. You meet tons of people and you learn how this process works. You see that from the inside. And again, I feel like that was a really pivotal sort of time in my grant writing career when I started doing these to really understand the inner dynamics of those. So sign up. If you won't qualify for the early career reviewer, you can still reach out to the NIH on their website. The same and request to be a regular peer reviewer through that process, and it's basically like just your CV or bio sketch.
Weird.
Is that my cue to someone gonna kick me off the stage or something? So so there's a QR code. It's a little bit small. It's in our slides, but there's also the website as well. And so I encourage you guys to consider this. SAEM will also advocate for emergency physicians to get onto standing study sections. And so on SAM's website, and I apologize, I don't have the link here, but they have a process where they will nominate you. So again, you just fill out a really brief form and add your CV and say what expertise you have. I'm not sure how successful they've been. I don't think they published their metrics, but again, it doesn't hurt to have sort of your home organization advocating for you. So that's another way to get on there. But again, really, really great experience. And then once you get called for one, you're gonna just keep getting called to the point where it actually becomes a little bit burdensome and you feel bad saying no. But they're always looking for people. And if you do a good job, they keep calling you back, and it'll help you build those relationships.
Thanks, Steph.
All right.
All right, I know we're running a little bit over, but thank you all for coming. So these are our takeaways, I think. Remember that I think as we kind of harped on, the review panels are people like us. They're diverse. You want to write to the lowest common denominator, which might just be me. And joining getting to know your PO, I think, is probably one of the most valuable things I learned in building these relationships. And I think like my PO talked to me, so I guess my personal story is I wrote my K, and I got not discussed, and it was a really sad time in my life. And my PO was like, Peter, you're an emergency physician. You guys want everything now. And research is not like that. It's like a marathon. It takes time. And I thought that was actually really good advice for me, because I was like, you're right. I gotta think my wife is a primary care doc, and she thinks a lot. And so I was like, I gotta do that more. And so I, skipped a cycle and took some time to figure out what they were doing and resubmitted, and I got funded. So it takes time, and you kind of gotta stick with it. And then please join study section. It's so amazing to see fellow emergency physicians at these study sections, because it's just great. And we need more of you guys, so please do that. So I know we've had some time for discussion. And thank you. And then I think, hey, what happened to our last slide? Oh, it's not here. Please, if you have any feedback, this is our second year doing this, but we would love to hear what other people think and what we could add to future iterations of this talk so we can help you guys. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks. Yeah, the QR code's at the back. Thank you guys so much for coming. Sorry we ran over, but the QR code I think maybe is on one of those, because they added it much later. So